The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the Hayes penthouse, casting its warm golden glow over the sprawling city below. From the heights of the Upper East Side, New York City seemed like a living, breathing entity, a mosaic of ambition, glittering skyscrapers, and a never-ending sea of people moving toward their goals. The towering skyline outside stood in stark contrast to the thoughts swirling inside Evelyn Hayes's mind as she gazed out from the comfort of her perfectly appointed living room. Evelyn Hayes had lived a full life, a life that was rich in blessings, filled with family, purpose, and the steadfast commitment to her faith. As the matriarch of one of the wealthiest families in New York, she was no stranger to influence, power, or public scrutiny. But it was her son, Jonathan, that had always been her pride and joy. Everything she did, everything she fought for, was for his future. Yet today, as she sat quietly in the corner of her plush sofa, her heart was unsettled. Her son, Jonathan Hayes, heir to the Hayes Corporation, a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate, had just announced his engagement to Sophie Lamont, a stunning, well-known socialite who had appeared regularly in the society columns for years. Jonathan's announcement had been met with excitement from the media and his circle of influential friends, but to Evelyn, it was a cause for concern. She'd spent months watching Sophie from afar, but something about the woman didn't sit well with her. Sophie was poised, charming, and socially adept, the very embodiment of grace in the public eye. But Evelyn knew deep down that there was more to people than what they allowed the world to see. She had spent a lifetime building a reputation of wisdom and prudence, and she trusted her instincts. And those instincts told her something was wrong. Sophie's beauty and elegance might be captivating, but Evelyn had learned to look deeper. It was her son's happiness that was at stake. She wasn't concerned about the wealth Sophie would gain from the union, nor was she worried about their lavish wedding plans. No, what troubled her most was the nagging feeling that Sophie's interest in Jonathan was not as pure as it seemed. Was Sophie marrying Jonathan for love or for something more? Could she really be the one God had intended for Jonathan, or was her heart set on something far more materialistic? Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, as if seeking guidance from above. In her quiet prayers, she often reminded herself of the scriptures that had grounded her life. Proverbs 31:10-12 spoke of the kind of woman her son deserved, the kind who would build him up, who would love him, who would be his companion in both prosperity and adversity. But Evelyn had seen nothing in Sophie's public persona that suggested those qualities. The woman was charming, yes, but charm could be a weapon in the hands of the wrong person. And Evelyn feared that Sophie's heart was not aligned with God's will. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her cell phone buzzing on the coffee table. Jonathan's name lit up the screen, followed by a picture of him grinning broadly. Evelyn couldn't help but smile. Her son, a man now in his early 30s, had always been the center of her world. From the time he was a boy, Jonathan had inherited his father's drive and ambition, but also his kindness and humility. He had taken over the leadership of Hayes Corporation after his father's passing, but he had remained deeply connected to his roots. Evelyn had hoped he would marry someone with a kindred spirit, someone whose values aligned with his own. Sophie, however, remained an enigma. "Hi, sweetheart," Evelyn answered, with a warmth in her voice that didn't quite reach her heart. "Mom, I have some amazing news," Jonathan said, his voice filled with excitement. "Sophie and I have set the wedding date. We're thinking December right before Christmas. We want it to be at the Plaza Hotel, the grandest celebration New York has ever seen. It'll be incredible." Evelyn's heart sank as she pictured the lavish affair, a wedding at the Plaza. It wasn't just a symbol of luxury, it was a signal that Sophie had her eyes set on Jonathan's wealth, not just his heart. "That sounds wonderful, darling," Evelyn said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. She smiled at the thought of her son's joy, even as doubt gnawed at her. Jonathan hesitated. "You don't sound thrilled. Mom, I know you've been skeptical about Sophie, but I'm telling you, she's the one. I know it. You've got to give her a chance." Evelyn sighed, knowing that Jonathan's heart was already fully invested in the engagement. "It's not that I'm skeptical, Jonathan. It's just that I want you to be sure. Marriage is a lifelong commitment, and I want to make sure she's the right person for you. A woman who will love you for who you are, not just for what you can provide." Jonathan was silent for a moment. "I get it, Mom, I really do, but you have to trust me on this one. I've never been more sure about anything in my life." Evelyn's eyes flickered toward the photo of her late husband on the mantel. James Hayes had built an empire from the ground up. His life had been marked by a quiet humility, a deep love for his family, and a fierce commitment to doing the right thing. Evelyn missed him every day. She often found herself wondering what he would think about Jonathan's choice of fiancée. She could imagine him shaking his head, knowing his son better than anyone else. But James was gone, and now it was Evelyn's turn to be the watchful protector. "I will try to spend more time with Sophie," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "But you know how I feel about these things. I've lived long enough to see how people can wear masks. I need to see her heart, Jonathan. I need to see who she really is." "I understand," Jonathan said with a sigh. "I'll let you know when we're planning something. I want you two to get along." After the call ended, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, the weight of her decision pressing on her chest. She had no intention of criticizing Sophie outright. She wanted to understand the woman's heart. But how could she truly know someone? How could she discern whether Sophie was acting in sincerity or out of selfish ambition? As the thought settled, an idea came to her. A radical, unconventional idea. Evelyn would need to test Sophie not through casual conversation or a dinner meeting, but through immersion. She would need to see the way Sophie behaved when she thought no one was watching, when the masks came off and the truth was revealed. The idea was bold, it was risky, but Evelyn was determined. Evelyn had long been an advocate of wisdom. Proverbs 4:7 had been a guiding verse in her life. The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom. Though it cost all you have, get understanding. To understand Sophie's true character, Evelyn would need to get close to her. But Sophie would never reveal her true self if she knew Evelyn was observing her. The solution was simple. Evelyn would need to become someone else. With a resolve that could only come from a deep, motherly love, Evelyn contacted Margaret, a trusted family friend who had worked in the Hayes household for years. Margaret had seen Jonathan grow up and had been one of the few who had truly understood Evelyn's protective nature. Together, Evelyn and Margaret devised a plan. Evelyn would pose as a maid in Jonathan's penthouse. She would work in the background, observing Sophie and Jonathan from a position of invisibility. This way, Evelyn could witness the truth without interference. Evelyn's heart was pounding as she looked at herself in the mirror, donning the simple grey uniform, white apron, and sensible shoes. The final touch was a wig, carefully chosen to make her appear older and more ordinary. Margaret had insisted on the wig, claiming it would make her unrecognizable. When Evelyn caught a glimpse of herself, she barely recognized the woman in the reflection. She had been so accustomed to her elegant image, her designer clothes, and her polished appearance. Now, she looked like someone entirely different, a woman of little consequence whose presence would go unnoticed. She could only pray that the disguise would work. "I hope this is worth it," she whispered to herself, stepping out of the bedroom, her mind a whirlwind of anticipation and apprehension. Evelyn arrived early the next morning, her heart pounding in her chest. The penthouse was everything Jonathan had promised. Sleek, modern, and suffused with luxury at every turn. But as Evelyn stepped inside, a strange feeling washed over her. She was no longer the revered matriarch of a powerful family. Now she was Martha, the humble maid, just another face in the sea of servants. Sophie was already there, reclining on the couch in a white silk robe, her long hair cascading over her shoulders like a shimmering waterfall. She looked every bit the glamorous socialite, her beauty both radiant and intimidating. Evelyn noted the way. Sophie absently flipped through a magazine without truly reading it, her eyes darting to her phone every few seconds as if waiting for a message. "Martha," Margaret introduced her, the name sounding foreign in Evelyn's ears. Sophie barely glanced up. "Fine," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Just don't touch my room without asking." Evelyn nodded, suppressing the urge to speak up. She would not let herself be seen. She would remain invisible, an unnoticed observer in this game of deception. As she started cleaning, wiping counters and organizing the kitchen, she couldn't help but watch Sophie closely. The day unfolded in a strange rhythm. Sophie had no interest in engaging with her new maid, except to give a few terse instructions. It became clear that Sophie's charm was something she reserved for high society, for the cameras, and for the people who could elevate her status. But in the privacy of the penthouse, her mask began to slip, if only for brief moments. Evelyn prayed for wisdom, knowing that this was only the beginning. She needed to uncover the truth, no matter what it cost. Evelyn had never felt so exposed in her life. For the past several days, she had carried out her undercover mission in Jonathan's penthouse without a hitch. No one had suspected her true identity, not Jonathan nor Sophie, who had barely acknowledged her presence beyond the occasional command to clean or adjust the decor. It was exactly as Evelyn had hoped. She was invisible, allowed to witness the dynamics between her son and his fiancée without interference. Yet this invisibility felt strangely uncomfortable. She found herself lingering longer in hallways, listening more intently to whispered conversations, her heart racing as she observed subtle shifts in behavior. There was a gnawing unease in her chest, a certainty that she was on the verge of uncovering something important, but something she wasn't sure she wanted to find. Sophie was an enigma. Her beauty, intelligence, and social grace were undeniable. Yet as Evelyn observed more closely, it became increasingly clear that Sophie's warmth was reserved for the spotlight, whenever there was a camera, a gala, or an audience. Behind the curtains of their private lives, Evelyn began to see glimpses of something else entirely, something cold, distant, and calculating. Sophie treated the household staff like invisible creatures who only existed to serve her needs. She never made eye contact, barely acknowledged their existence, and never once offered a word of gratitude or kindness. Evelyn had seen this behavior before, the way people who were used to privilege could treat others as if they were beneath them. It was in moments like these that Evelyn's faith reminded her of the importance of discernment. Scripture often spoke of the heart's deceitfulness, how easily it could mask selfishness, pride, and even manipulation. Jeremiah 17:9. On the third day of her maid duties, Sophie had asked her to prepare breakfast, while Jonathan took an important business call in the next room. Evelyn took note of the way Sophie demanded her food to be prepared, her voice high-pitched and condescending. "Make sure the eggs are soft but not too runny." "I can't stand that," Sophie had said, her tone clipped. "And don't forget the avocado toast, it needs to be perfect. Jonathan doesn't like anything less than perfect." Evelyn's heart stirred as she processed Sophie's words. In all her years of raising Jonathan, she had taught him that perfection was a pursuit of the heart, an inward change, not outward appearance. Yet Sophie seemed to equate perfection with outward approval, using her beauty and charm as tools to manipulate those around her into fulfilling her desires. It was this shallowness that troubled Evelyn most. Would her son be content in a marriage with a woman who saw life as a performance, not a relationship built on trust, love, and mutual respect? Later that afternoon, as she wiped down the countertops, Evelyn overheard Sophie speaking to someone on the phone in a hushed tone. The conversation was brief but telling. "I told you I'd get him to propose," Sophie said, her voice low and secretive. "Now we just have to wait. Once I have access to the trust fund, it's all ours. I'm almost there. Don't mess this up for me, Ricky." Evelyn froze in place, her heart beating loudly in her chest. Ricky. She had heard the name before. Sophie had dropped it in passing during her earlier conversations, But this was the first time she'd heard Sophie's tone betray something more. A sense of entitlement, of someone using another for their own gain. Evelyn's stomach churned with the implications of the conversation. Who was this Ricky? What was Sophie's true motive in marrying Jonathan? Evelyn quickly excused herself to the kitchen, where she pretended to work while processing the information. Could Sophie really be using Jonathan as a stepping stone toward securing access to his wealth? Evelyn had heard whispers from a few of the household staff about Sophie's extravagant lifestyle, the parties she attended, and the designer clothes she always wore. There was something about Sophie's wealth that didn't seem earned. It seemed borrowed, like someone who was living in the shadow of something much grander. But why? Why would a woman who had everything in terms of material wealth still feel the need to manipulate and deceive? Evelyn had never been a woman to jump to conclusions. She had learned long ago the importance of patience and understanding, to wait for the truth to reveal itself, as the Bible urged in 1 Thessalonians 5:21. But test everything, hold fast what is good. And that's exactly what she intended to do. She would not confront Sophie just yet. She needed more evidence. This was only the beginning. The following day, Evelyn decided to attend a charity event with Jonathan and Sophie. It was a lavish affair, typical of the circles they moved in, held in one of the city's grandest venues. Evelyn knew that this would give her an opportunity to observe Sophie in a public setting. It was one thing to witness how Sophie behaved behind closed doors, but it was another to see how she carried herself in front of others. As they entered the venue, Evelyn marveled at Sophie's effortless charm. She seemed to glide through the crowd, her every move perfectly calculated, each smile and handshake performed with precision. Jonathan, ever the dutiful fiancé, stood by her side, his eyes constantly searching for approval in Sophie's gaze. The connection between them seemed fragile, almost like a performance rather than a real relationship. Evelyn noticed how Sophie's attention seemed divided between Jonathan and the other men at the event. She laughed a little too hard at jokes from the older, wealthier donors and engaged in private conversations with several men, her eyes always scanning the room. But what struck Evelyn the most was the way Sophie subtly dismissed Jonathan's attempts to engage her in meaningful conversation. Whenever he spoke to her, she responded with polite but disinterested replies, her eyes constantly darting across the room to find other, more important people. Evelyn saw it with her own eyes, the disconnection, the manipulation. It was as though Sophie was playing a part, one that was convincing enough to the outside world, but one that would soon unravel once the performance ended. This wasn't love, it was a transaction. When Jonathan stepped away for a brief moment to speak with a colleague, Evelyn found herself standing next to Sophie, who was now sipping champagne and glancing around the room. Evelyn decided to take a chance. "You know, Sophie," Evelyn said casually, "I've noticed how much Jonathan truly cares for you. It's rare to see him so happy. He's been talking about the wedding non-stop." Sophie's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, he's adorable like that," she said with a dismissive flick of her hand. "But he needs to learn that life isn't just about making people happy. There are other things at play." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. There it was again, the same coldness she'd sensed behind closed doors. Sophie's words, though soft, dripped with a certain level of disdain for Jonathan's earnestness. This wasn't just about love for her, it was about securing her place in the world. "Other things at play?" Evelyn asked carefully. Her curiosity piqued. Sophie took another sip of champagne and glanced around, ensuring no one was paying too much attention. "Yes," she said, leaning in a little closer. "There's more to Jonathan than meets the eye. His family's wealth is vast, and once we're married, everything will be mine. All the comforts, all the status." She laughed lightly, but it was a hollow sound. "He doesn't even realize that I've been playing my cards just right." Evelyn's mind raced. She had suspected something, but hearing Sophie's words confirmed it. This was not just about Jonathan. This was about Sophie securing her place in a life of luxury. She was playing a dangerous game, and if she succeeded, it could cost Jonathan more than he could ever imagine. But Evelyn wasn't going to let that happen. She knew she had to act, but she also knew that rushing into confrontation wouldn't help. Jonathan was still too enraptured by Sophie's beauty and charm to see what lay beneath. No, Evelyn would have to be patient. She would continue her observations, continue gathering the evidence needed to protect her son from a future that would bring him nothing but heartache. As the evening wore on, Evelyn's mind didn't wander from the unsettling conversation she had just had with Sophie. She continued to watch her, noticing the subtle ways in which Sophie manipulated the social scene, drawing attention to herself without ever really engaging with anyone in a meaningful way. Evelyn thought back to the Bible verse she had read that morning, 1 Corinthians 13:4-5, which described love as patient, kind, not self-seeking. There was no love in Sophie's actions. There was only ambition and self-interest. But Evelyn also reminded herself that wisdom was not just in recognizing the truth, it was in how one responded to it. James 1:5 spoke clearly, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him." Evelyn prayed silently, asking for the wisdom to know how to proceed. She could see the danger, but she needed God's guidance on what to do next. As she stood in the shadows, watching Jonathan dance with Sophie and looking at the joyful, innocent expression on his face, Evelyn's heart ached. Her son was in love, and love had clouded his vision. It was her duty, as a mother and protector, to ensure that he wasn't walking into a trap. And so Evelyn would continue her mission. She would not confront Sophie directly, not yet, but she would watch, listen, and pray. And when the time came, she would reveal the truth, no matter how painful it might be for Jonathan. The days seemed to blend together in a haze of observation and anxiety as Evelyn Hayes navigated her role as Martha, the unassuming maid in Jonathan's penthouse. Each day, she watched Sophie with increasing scrutiny, piecing together fragments of behavior that hinted at a deeper, more calculating nature than anyone could see at first glance. Sophie had played her part well, and Evelyn had to admit that her son's fiancé was a master of disguise. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. But Evelyn had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. Evelyn spent her days cleaning, organizing, and cooking, all while keeping a careful distance from Sophie. Despite her best efforts to remain invisible, she couldn't help but observe the way Sophie moved through the penthouse. Each action carefully calculated, every word spoken with purpose. It was becoming increasingly clear that Sophie was not the woman Jonathan believed her to be. Evelyn's heart was heavy as she watched her son continue to fall deeper into the trap Sophie had set. Jonathan had become enchanted by her beauty, her charm, and the way she seemed to support his every ambition. But Evelyn knew better. The longer she watched, the more convinced she became that Sophie's love for Jonathan was as shallow as the gold-dipped world she inhabited. Sophie wasn't interested in Jonathan for who he was. She was interested in what he could give her. And Evelyn could see it in the way Sophie spoke of her future, in the way she dismissed Jonathan's needs and desires as though they were secondary to her own. One evening, as Evelyn stood by the kitchen counter, she overheard Sophie on the phone again. This time, she didn't try to mask her voice, and Evelyn could hear the cold, calculating tone with which she spoke. "I can't stand this, Ricky," Sophie said, her voice clipped with impatience. "Jonathan's starting to ask questions. He's getting suspicious, and it's only a matter of time before he figures out that I'm not the woman he thinks I am. I need you to move faster. We're running out of time." Evelyn's pulse quickened. Ricky. This was the second time she'd heard his name, and each time Sophie's tone suggested an intimate and conspiratorial relationship. Evelyn's mind raced. Who was Ricky? And what was Sophie's true connection to him? Was he the key to understanding Sophie's real intentions? Evelyn knew she had to find out more. That evening, as Sophie left the penthouse to attend yet another glamorous charity gala, Evelyn took the opportunity to search the apartment. Jonathan had gone to his office, leaving her with a rare moment of solitude. She knew the risk. Searching the apartment without permission was not something she had planned to do, but something inside her urged her to take action. She had to find the truth, even if it meant going to extreme measures. Evelyn moved quietly through the penthouse, careful not to disturb anything. She started with Sophie's private study, where the young woman often spent her time on the phone or looking over documents. As she entered, the faint scent of Sophie's expensive perfume lingered in the air, mingling with the fresh scent of the polished wood furniture. Evelyn's eyes scanned the room, and it wasn't long before she found something that sent a chill through her. Sophie's desk was immaculate, but inside one of the drawers, Evelyn found a stack of papers. She flipped through them carefully, her heart racing as she realized they were documents related to Jonathan's family's trust fund, documents that only a select few would have access to. As she read through the papers, she saw mention of Sophie's name, alongside terms that spoke of access to funds upon marriage. It was clear this wasn't just about love. This was a financial strategy, and Sophie was poised to make her move as soon as she married Jonathan. Evelyn's mind spun as she pieced it all together. Sophie had been playing a game of long-term manipulation. She hadn't fallen in love with Jonathan. She had set her sights on the wealth he represented, and now she was preparing to secure that wealth by any means necessary. Sophie's sudden interest in Jonathan's trust fund, the hidden phone calls, the secret meetings, it all made sense now. Sophie was not just marrying Jonathan for love. She was marrying him for the financial security and status that came with him. Evelyn felt a wave of nausea wash over her. How could her son, her beloved Jonathan, have been so blind? He was intelligent, compassionate, and full of potential, yet he was falling into the trap of a woman who saw him as a means to an end. Evelyn had always tried to raise him to be discerning, to see beyond the surface, but Sophie had played on Jonathan's good nature and his desire for a fairy tale romance. Evelyn took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She knew what she had to do next. She couldn't let this go on any longer. She had to expose Sophie for who she truly was, but doing so would be no easy task. Jonathan was already emotionally invested in Sophie, and confronting her could create a rift between mother and son. But Evelyn's love for her son was stronger than any fear she had. She had to protect him, even if it meant losing his trust in the short term. Just as Evelyn was about to return the documents to the drawer, she heard the sound of the elevator door opening. She quickly stuffed the papers back into the drawer and stepped away, her heart racing. Sophie was back from the gala. Evelyn's pulse quickened as she moved swiftly to the kitchen to regain her composure. Sophie entered the apartment, looking radiant as ever, her evening gown shimmering under the soft lights of the penthouse. She tossed her coat over a chair and made her way toward the kitchen, where Evelyn was still standing, pretending to be busy with a pot of soup. "You're still here?" Sophie said with a raised eyebrow, her voice dripping with condescension. "You didn't leave yet." Evelyn smiled politely, but there was no mistaking the coldness in her eyes. "I was just finishing up with dinner, Miss Lamont. Will you be needing anything else?" Sophie paused, taking in Evelyn's calm demeanor. "No, I'm fine," she said, dismissing Evelyn with a flick of her hand. But then, as if remembering something, Sophie added, "Oh, and don't forget to clean the guest bedroom. Jonathan's parents are coming over tomorrow, and I want everything to be perfect. They're very particular." Evelyn nodded, keeping her voice steady. "Of course, I'll make sure everything is in order." As Sophie moved toward her bedroom, Evelyn felt her resolve harden. The time for subtlety had passed. She had to act, and she had to do it soon. Jonathan couldn't go on living in this illusion. He needed to know the truth, and Evelyn was the only one who could deliver it. Later that evening, when Jonathan returned home, Evelyn was waiting for him. She had made a simple dinner, but her mind was preoccupied with the conversation she was about to have. This wouldn't be easy. She had to be careful, but she couldn't let her son marry a woman who had already shown her true colors. Jonathan walked into the kitchen looking exhausted but happy. "Mom, I'm so glad you're still here. You wouldn't believe the day I had," he said, smiling warmly at her. Evelyn returned his smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I've been thinking, Jonathan," she said softly, her voice calm but firm. "I need to talk to you about something important." Jonathan's smile faltered slightly, sensing the change in her tone. "What's wrong, Mom? Is everything okay?" Evelyn took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Jonathan, I've been observing Sophie for a while now. I've spent time with her, gotten to know her, and I have some concerns. I don't want to hurt you, but I need you to understand the truth. Sophie is not who you think she is." Jonathan's face paled, his expression shifting from confusion to concern. "What are you talking about? Sophie is the love of my life. She's everything I've ever wanted." Evelyn shook her head, her heart aching. "I know you want to believe that, but Jonathan, I've seen the way she treats others. I've overheard her conversations. She's not in this for love. She's in it for what you can provide her. Sophie is after your family's wealth, and I've found proof." Jonathan looked at her in disbelief. "You're wrong, Mom. Sophie loves me. She's always been there for me." "No," Evelyn said, her voice firm. "I've seen the way she manipulates people. She's using you, Jonathan, and I can't sit by and watch you make the biggest mistake of your life." For a moment, Jonathan stood frozen, the weight of his mother's words sinking in. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His gaze dropped to the floor, and Evelyn knew he was fighting with the truth she had just laid before him. "Please," Evelyn said softly, her voice breaking. "You're my son, and I love you. I want you to be happy, but not at the cost of your heart. Want your future. You deserve someone who loves you for who you are, not for what you have." Jonathan stood in silence, his face a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and pain. He didn't know what to believe, but one thing was clear: his world was starting to crumble. The following days after Evelyn's confrontation with Jonathan felt like an emotional battleground. Jonathan had remained distant, often retreating to his office, shutting out his mother's warnings. He had been silent, even aloof, as if the words Evelyn spoke had created a gulf between them that neither knew how to cross. Evelyn spent her days going through the motions, continuing her work as Martha in the Penthouse, keeping a watchful eye on Sophie and praying fervently. Each day the weight of her secret grew heavier, but she knew she couldn't give up, not when the stakes were so high. Despite her best efforts, Evelyn could see that the confrontation with Jonathan had left scars. Her son had looked at her with confusion and disbelief, as though the very notion that Sophie could deceive him was unfathomable. To Jonathan, Sophie had been his future, the woman he had imagined building a life with, the woman who understood his ambition, his dreams. But Evelyn saw past the surface. She could see the cracks in Sophie's facade, and it only made her more determined to expose them. However, Evelyn was not the only one who noticed the tension. Sophie, too, seemed to sense the shift. She had always been an expert in manipulating situations, but there was something different in the air now. Evelyn saw it in the way Sophie subtly changed her behavior, trying to maintain her perfect image. She was more careful, more calculated, aware that her hold on Jonathan was being tested. Evelyn watched Sophie from the shadows, trying to piece together the final clues that would expose her once and for all. She had overheard Sophie on the phone with Ricky, and it was clear now that the two shared a secret relationship. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie had been playing Jonathan all along, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Sophie wasn't the only one hiding secrets. Jonathan had his own unresolved issues, his unresolved feelings for Vanessa, his high school sweetheart, who had reappeared in his life shortly before Sophie had come into the picture. Evelyn had noticed the way Jonathan looked at Vanessa, the way his voice softened when he spoke of her. She could see the way his heart hesitated when he was around her. The affection he had for Vanessa was still there, buried beneath the layers of time and distance, but Evelyn knew that his commitment to Sophie was now clouding his judgment. Evelyn had to act quickly. Jonathan's heart was caught between two women, one of whom he thought he loved, and the other who was playing him for her own gain. She couldn't let him make the mistake of choosing the wrong woman, not when he had the chance to find real love, genuine love that would honor him and God. One morning, after a restless night of prayer, Evelyn decided to take matters into her own hands. She couldn't wait for Jonathan to come around. She needed to expose Sophie before it was too late. The clock was ticking, and she knew that the longer she allowed Sophie to manipulate Jonathan, the harder it would be to pull him away from the illusion. Sophie had taken to spending her mornings in the living room, enjoying a breakfast of expensive pastries and coffee as though she had all the time in the world. Evelyn had noticed that Sophie was meticulous about her appearance, even in the early hours of the day. Her flawless makeup, her perfectly styled hair, the pristine clothes, everything was a carefully crafted image. Evelyn had come to realize that Sophie wasn't just pretending to be something she wasn't. She was fabricating an entirely new identity. But Evelyn had learned to be patient. She had seen how Sophie was slipping up, letting her guard down in subtle ways. There was a moment, for instance, when Sophie had been alone in the kitchen and left her phone unlocked on the counter. Evelyn had hesitated, but the temptation to see what Sophie was hiding was too strong to resist. She had waited until Sophie was out of the room, then snuck over to the phone, praying it would offer her some insight into Sophie's intentions. The phone revealed a treasure trove of secrets. First, there were the messages to Ricky, dozens of them filled with phrases like, "We're almost there," "I'll get him to trust me," and "We'll be together soon." These messages were proof that Sophie's intentions were far from innocent. She had been manipulating Jonathan from the start, using him as a pawn in a much larger game. There were also more details on Sophie's financial situation, her substantial debts, her dealings with various business associates who had shady reputations. It was all beginning to piece together in a way that made Evelyn's stomach churn. But there was one message that stood out the most. Sophie had sent Ricky a text just the night before, after their argument about Jonathan's increasing suspicions. The message read, "I know it's taking longer than we thought, but once I'm married to him, we can finally start living the life we deserve. Just wait until the honeymoon phase is over. He'll be mine, body, soul, and fortune." Evelyn's heart sank. This was it. This was the confirmation she needed. Sophie wasn't in love with Jonathan. She was in love with his wealth and his status, and she was willing to do whatever it took to secure them. Ricky, whoever he was an accomplice in her deceit, and together they were plotting to tear Jonathan's life apart. Evelyn was about to return the phone to its place when she heard the sound of the elevator doors opening. She quickly slipped away, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that she had to be careful. She couldn't risk Sophie discovering that she had been snooping through her things. But as Evelyn retreated into the hallway, she found herself face to face with Jonathan, who had just come back from a meeting. He looked tired, his face drawn, but there was a fire in his eyes. It was the same fire she had seen in him when he was a child, when he had faced challenges and overcome them with strength and courage. But now the fire seemed dimmed by uncertainty. "Mom," Jonathan said, his voice tight, "I need to talk to you." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She knew this was the moment. This was the conversation that would change everything. "I've been thinking about what you said," Jonathan continued, his words slow and deliberate. "I've been trying to understand, to see what you see in Sophie, but it's hard. I love her, Mom. I've given my heart to her, and it feels like you're asking me to choose between her and you." His voice cracked, the weight of his emotions pressing down on him. Evelyn reached out and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Jonathan, I'm not asking you to choose between us. I'm asking you to see the truth. Sophie is not the woman you think she is. She's playing you, and I can't sit back and watch you make the same mistake I've seen so many others make." Jonathan shook his head, the frustration evident in his eyes. "You don't understand. I know Sophie better than anyone. She's not perfect, but she loves me. I can feel it." Evelyn's gaze softened. She could see the pain in his eyes, the pain of a son torn between his love and his mother's warning. "Jonathan, I know you want to believe that, but love isn't about what someone can give you. It's about what you can give them. And Sophie, she doesn't love you. She loves your wealth, your status, and the life you can give her. That's the truth." Jonathan recoiled, his face contorted with confusion and disbelief. "You don't know that. You don't know her like I do." "I know enough," Evelyn replied, her voice steady. "I know enough to see the truth in her actions, in the way she manipulates everything around her. And I know that if you marry her, you'll be walking into a life of pain and heartbreak." Jonathan stood there silent for a moment, as though weighing her words. Finally he spoke, his voice softer now. "What should I do, Mom? I don't know who to trust anymore." Evelyn's heart broke for him. She knew how difficult this was, but she couldn't back down now. "You need to open your eyes, Jonathan. Trust your heart, but also trust your faith. God will never lead you into a relationship that will destroy you. Seek His wisdom, and He will guide you to the right path." Jonathan didn't reply immediately, but his eyes were filled with a storm of emotions. Evelyn could see that the truth was slowly sinking in, and for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. It had been a week since Evelyn's confrontation with Jonathan. She had tried to remain patient, to let her son come to terms with what she had told him about Sophie. But each day felt like an eternity. Jonathan had become more distant, retreating into himself, unsure of who to trust. Every interaction with Sophie seemed more strained, and his conversations with his mother became laced with more tension and confusion. It was as if he were standing at a precipice, unable to see the way forward. Evelyn spent her days going about her routine, continuing to play her part as Martha, keeping a careful watch over Sophie. She had already made up her mind that Sophie's intentions were as transparent as they were dangerous. But what worried Evelyn the most was her son's inability to see the truth. Jonathan had always been a man of reason, a man who trusted in logic and hard evidence, but when it came to Sophie, he seemed blinded by love, or perhaps by a vision of the future he had created in his mind. It was on one of these trying days that Vanessa returned. Vanessa had been Jonathan's high school sweetheart, the girl he had shared his dreams with before life had swept him into the whirlwind of success and responsibility. The two had been inseparable back then, bound by shared history, mutual respect, and a deep connection that had grown from years of friendship. But when Jonathan had gone off to college and started to rise in the business world, he had grown distant, and their relationship had slowly faded. Vanessa had stayed in their small town, completing her degree and living a quiet life, while Jonathan's world expanded beyond his wildest dreams. Now, years later, she stood in the lobby of Jonathan's apartment building, a mixture of emotions written all over her face. She had come to the city for a job interview, but more than anything, she had come to reconnect with Jonathan. Evelyn was the one who opened the door when Vanessa rang the bell. There was a brief moment of recognition before a smile slowly crept onto Evelyn's face. She remembered Vanessa well. She had always been kind and sincere, someone who had made a genuine impact on Jonathan's life. "Vanessa, it's been so long," Evelyn said warmly, her voice betraying a hint of nostalgia. "I didn't expect to see you today. What brings you to the city?" Vanessa smiled, though it was clear that her smile masked an inner uncertainty. "It's good to see you too, Mrs. Hart. I'm in town for a job interview, actually. I didn't want to drop by unannounced, but I thought it might be nice to catch up." Evelyn's heart sank a little. She knew that Jonathan had always held a special place in his heart for Vanessa. He had spoken of her fondly in their occasional conversations, though he had never mentioned her since he became engaged to Sophie. But Evelyn knew that this visit could either help Jonathan see the truth about Sophie or complicate matters even more. "Jonathan is home," Evelyn said, her voice softening. "He's been a bit preoccupied, but I'm sure he would love to see you." As Vanessa stepped inside the apartment, she felt a sense of déjà vu. The modern furnishings, the sleek design. It was all a far cry from the small apartment she had shared with Jonathan years ago, but it still carried the essence of who he was. She could almost picture him here, the man she had once known so well, before ambition and power had reshaped him into someone else. But as Vanessa looked around, a knot tightened in her stomach. There was something different about him now, a distance, a coldness she hadn't seen before. Jonathan emerged from his office just as Vanessa was taking a seat in the living room. His eyes widened when he saw her standing there. For a moment, time seemed to slow, and he was transported back to the simpler days of their youth. The same warmth in her smile, the same sparkle in her eyes. It was as if no time had passed at all. "Vanessa," he said softly, almost as if speaking her name for the first time in years. "I didn't expect this. What are you doing here?" "I'm in town for a job interview," Vanessa explained, her voice a little more tentative than she intended. "But mostly, I wanted to catch up. I know it's been a while, and I thought I'd take the chance to see how you've been." Jonathan's expression softened, though there was an underlying tension in his gaze. "I've been doing well, you know. Work's been busy, but it's all part of the ride." Vanessa nodded, but she could sense the wall Jonathan had built between them. It wasn't intentional, but it was there. She knew that the man she had once known had changed, and it hurt to see him this way. But she also knew that part of her still cared for him in ways she hadn't fully acknowledged until now. "Do you still remember the old diner we used to go to?" Vanessa asked, trying to break the ice. "The one with the terrible coffee and the even worse muffins?" Jonathan's lips curved into a faint smile. "How could I forget? We spent hours there talking about everything, our plans for the future, our hopes, our dreams." The nostalgia in his voice was palpable, and for a brief moment, the tension seemed to lift. Vanessa felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for them to reconnect. But the reality of the situation soon settled back in, and she was reminded of the things that had separated them. The ambition, the distance, and the other woman in Jonathan's life. Sophie. Vanessa couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy at the thought of her. She hadn't met Sophie yet, but Jonathan had spoken about her often enough. She was the one Jonathan had chosen, the one who had captured his heart. And Vanessa, well, she had faded into the background. As the conversation continued, Vanessa found herself torn between the old feelings she still had for Jonathan and the reality of the man he had become. It wasn't just the success, the wealth, or the apartment that had changed him. It was something deeper, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Jonathan was different, and she wasn't sure if that difference was something she could reconcile with the version of him she had known. At that moment, as they exchanged pleasantries, Evelyn stepped in, offering them both a chance to sit down at the dining table for coffee. The subtle tension between Jonathan and Vanessa was unmistakable, and Evelyn, ever perceptive, sensed it. She could see the way Jonathan's eyes flickered between Vanessa and the door, as if he were caught between two worlds, his past and his present. Vanessa looked at Jonathan, her heart heavy with the weight of unspoken words. "I know things have changed between us, John, and I don't want to make things complicated. But I came here because I wanted to see if we could start over, if there's still a chance for us, or if I'm just holding on to a dream that's no longer yours." Jonathan's expression faltered. The words hit him harder than he expected. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine what life might have been like had he never left Vanessa behind, had he never chosen the path that led him to Sophie. The memories of their youth, their laughter, their shared dreams, were alive again in his heart, and for the first time in years, he wondered if he had made a mistake. But as he looked at Vanessa, he saw something more, a longing, a hope that perhaps he could rekindle what they had once shared. But there was something else there too, a sense of finality, as if Vanessa had already accepted that whatever had been between them was gone. "I don't know what to say," Jonathan replied softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel anymore." Evelyn watched the exchange silently, her heart aching for her son. She knew that Jonathan's heart was conflicted, torn between the woman he had once loved and the one he had chosen to build a future with. But she also knew that Jonathan had to make his own choice, one that would define his future and the life he would lead. Meanwhile, across the room, Sophie stood in the shadows, her eyes narrowing as she watched the scene unfold. She had arrived at the apartment just in time to hear Vanessa's confession, just in time to see Jonathan's heart torn between the two women. A storm was brewing inside her, one she could no longer ignore. Sophie wasn't about to lose Jonathan, not to Vanessa, not to anyone. She had come too far, had invested too much to let a blast from Jonathan's past take him away from her. As the tension grew thicker in the room, Sophie made her decision. As the days passed, Jonathan's life became more complicated with each passing moment. Vanessa's unexpected return stirred up feelings he hadn't realized he still harbored, and Evelyn's concerns about Sophie only grew louder in his mind. Sophie, for her part, had been acting increasingly distant. Though she hid it well, Jonathan couldn't help but notice the tension that lingered between them. Every interaction seemed a little colder, a little more strained. He questioned the real motivations behind her actions, but the idea that someone might be trying to deceive him felt like a betrayal of everything they had built together. Sophie, ever the poised and elegant woman, could only hide her true feelings for so long. Beneath the surface, her own secret life had been flourishing, one that would threaten everything Jonathan had worked so hard to build. She had been hiding a relationship with Ricky, a man from her past, who had played an instrumental part in her plans. What she had not counted on, however, was Jonathan's uncharacteristic emotional conflict. Vanessa's sudden reappearance in his life, and the feelings that came with it, had set a series of events in motion that Sophie wasn't prepared for. Jonathan found himself waking up early each day, a swirl of thoughts constantly racing through his mind. It wasn't just about Vanessa anymore, it was about Sophie, about what she might be hiding. Something in her actions was off. There were the subtle changes in her demeanor, the way her attention seemed to wander whenever he spoke about the future, the way she'd avoid any conversation about marriage plans. It wasn't like Sophie to shy away from details. She had always been meticulous, always had everything planned out. One night, unable to sleep, Jonathan decided to confront Sophie. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. He had to ask her. He had to get to the bottom of it before everything spiraled further out of control. Sophie was sitting on the couch, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the evening light filtering through the windows. She looked peaceful, almost ethereal, but Jonathan could see the subtle tension in her posture. She was sitting upright, hands clasped neatly in her lap, a distant look in her eyes. It was the same way she had looked when he had mentioned Vanessa, like she was putting on a mask to hide something deep within. "Sophie," Jonathan said softly, sitting down beside her, "we need to talk." Her eyes flickered, but she quickly masked her unease with a practiced smile. "Of course, Jonathan, what's on your mind?" Jonathan hesitated for a moment, wondering how to approach the conversation. There was so much he wanted to say, but he didn't want to scare her off. "I've been thinking about things," he began, choosing his words carefully. "About us, about our future." Sophie's smile didn't falter, but something cold flickered in her eyes. She wasn't surprised. "Our future?" she repeated, her voice smooth, but with an edge. "What about it?" Jonathan could feel his pulse quicken. This was it. He had to be honest. "I don't know if I can go through with this. I've been having doubts." Sophie's gaze sharpened, and for a moment Jonathan felt the weight of her scrutiny. She didn't speak immediately, but her fingers tightened around the edge of her glass. It was a subtle sign, but it didn't go unnoticed. "Doubts?" she asked, her voice low and controlled. "About us? About our marriage?" Jonathan nodded, his heart racing. "I think something's wrong, Sophie, and I'm not sure what it is, but I can't ignore it any longer. You've been distant. You've been avoiding certain things, and I don't know if it's because of me or if there's something you're hiding." Sophie's lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Jonathan, you're overthinking things," she said, trying to sound calm. "I'm just tired, that's all. Planning a wedding, managing the business, it's all a lot of work. But I promise you, there's nothing to worry about." Jonathan didn't believe her. The more she spoke, the more he felt that something wasn't right, but he couldn't prove it. Not yet. "Then why don't you tell me what's really going on, Sophie?" Jonathan asked, leaning in slightly, his voice growing firm. "I need to know. I can't go on like this, in the dark. You're my fiancé. If we're going to spend the rest of our lives together, there can't be secrets between us." Sophie's mask cracked for a moment. There was a flicker of something, fear, guilt, maybe both, but just as quickly, it disappeared. She stood up and moved to the window, looking out over the city, as if collecting herself. "You're being paranoid, Jonathan," she said quietly. "I've told you everything you need to know. Let's not make a big deal out of nothing." But Jonathan wasn't convinced. As much as he tried to trust her, the unease that had been growing in his chest wouldn't dissipate. He couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie was hiding something from him, something important. He needed answers. The truth about Sophie's secret relationship with Ricky had been carefully hidden, buried beneath layers of lies and manipulation. Sophie had met Ricky years ago when she was still working at a small marketing firm in Brooklyn. They had shared a whirlwind romance, one that was passionate and full of promise. But when she met Jonathan and realized the opportunities that came with him, his wealth, his influence, Sophie made a choice. She chose Jonathan. But Ricky wasn't easily discarded. He had played a significant role in Sophie's rise to where she was now, and he had his own ambitions. While Sophie had carefully crafted her relationship with Jonathan, she had kept Ricky close, using him to her advantage. She had even convinced herself that she could have both men in her life, the wealthy fiancé who would provide her with a future, and the secret lover who could give her the excitement she craved. But as Jonathan's suspicions grew, Sophie knew that the truth could no longer remain hidden. The lies were starting to unravel, and she had to make a choice, whether to fight for Jonathan or to escape with Ricky. That night, after her conversation with Jonathan, Sophie found herself sitting alone in their bedroom, staring at her phone. Ricky had been calling her, leaving messages, but she hadn't returned his calls. She knew she had to act fast. If she didn't, everything she had worked for would come crashing down. She made the call. "Ricky," she said, her voice trembling with both fear and determination, "I need you, now." Ricky's voice on the other end was calm, too calm for Sophie's liking. "What's going on, Sophie? Is everything okay with Jonathan?" Sophie swallowed hard, gathering her thoughts. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. He's starting to question me. He's starting to notice something's wrong. You need to keep him in the dark, Sophie. Don't let him find out about us." Sophie's hand shook as she held the phone. "I don't know if I can do this anymore. I'm not sure I want to." "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Ricky said, his tone turning more forceful. "You know what's at stake here." Sophie took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had to make her decision, but no matter what she chose, there would be no going back. The tension had been building for weeks, but now, with everything hanging in the balance, Jonathan couldn't ignore the whispers in his mind any longer. His life, once carefully planned out, was beginning to unravel before him. The woman he had thought he could trust, the woman he had planned to marry, was keeping secrets from him, secrets that threatened everything he had believed about their relationship. Jonathan's internal struggle had reached its breaking point. He was torn between the woman he thought he loved, Sophie, and his long-lost feelings for Vanessa, who had reappeared at a time when Jonathan was most vulnerable. And yet, despite the pull of Vanessa's presence, his heart kept returning to Sophie, to the life they had planned together. But the lies were becoming too much to ignore, and he could no longer stand by while everything he had built with Sophie hung in the balance. One cold, crisp evening, Jonathan decided to confront Sophie once and for all. He had invited her to dinner at their usual spot, the place where they had celebrated so many milestones in their relationship. It was meant to be a simple evening, a chance for them to talk without distractions. But beneath the surface, Jonathan knew that this dinner would mark a turning point in their relationship, whether they were ready for it or not. Sophie arrived at the restaurant as poised and polished as ever. Her smile was warm, but there was a hint of unease in her eyes, a flicker Jonathan hadn't seen before. She slid into the booth across from him, her fingers nervously fiddling with the edge of her napkin. But Jonathan was no longer distracted by her beauty or charm. He had made up his mind. "Sophie," he began, his voice steady but tinged with an undercurrent of tension, "we need to talk." Her smile faltered just for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Of course, Jonathan. What's on your mind?" Jonathan took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about us, about our future. And I need to ask you something that's been bothering me for a while now." Sophie's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" "I know you're hiding something, Sophie," Jonathan said, his voice low but firm. "I don't know what it is, but I can feel it. There's something you're not telling me, and I can't go on pretending that everything is fine when it's not." For a brief moment, Sophie's mask cracked. Jonathan saw the flash of panic in her eyes, quickly followed by the guarded look she had perfected over the years. She leaned back, crossing her arms, as if trying to shield herself from the conversation. "Jonathan, I don't know what you're talking about. There's nothing to hide." Jonathan didn't believe her. "You've been distant lately, Sophie. You've been avoiding me, avoiding our future. And now, with Vanessa coming back into the picture, it feels like I don't know who you are anymore." Sophie's expression darkened. "You're still thinking about her, aren't you?" Her voice was sharp now, almost accusing. "You've been so focused on Vanessa that you can't even see what's right in front of you." Jonathan's chest tightened at the mention of Vanessa's name. He had been trying to move past his feelings for her, but they kept resurfacing, and Sophie's jealousy only made the situation worse. "This isn't about Vanessa. It's about you, Sophie. I can't ignore what's going on between us. You're keeping secrets from me." Sophie looked away, her gaze distant. Jonathan's heart ached as he saw the vulnerability in her posture, but he couldn't let that stop him. He had to know the truth. "I don't want to lose you, Sophie," Jonathan continued, his voice softening. "But I can't keep pretending that everything is okay. What are you hiding?" Sophie took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while, she seemed truly unsure of herself. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she said quietly. "But I can't keep lying to you." Jonathan leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Tell me everything." Sophie paused, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked up her wine glass. She took a sip as if buying time before finally looking Jonathan in the eye. "There's someone else," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone from my past." Jonathan's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "I've been seeing Ricky again," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "Before I met you, he and I were involved. And when things got complicated with you, when I saw what we could have together, I kept him around. I never stopped seeing him." Jonathan felt the world tilt on its axis. His mind raced, processing the words, trying to make sense of what Sophie had just confessed. She had been seeing someone else all along, and now everything they had was in question. "Why, Sophie?" Jonathan asked, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Why would you do this? Why would you lie to me?" Sophie's face crumpled with guilt, and for the first time, Jonathan saw the cracks in her perfect facade. "I was afraid, Jonathan," she said, her voice breaking. "Afraid that I wasn't enough, that I wasn't good enough for you. You had everything, and I had nothing. Ricky, he made me feel wanted, important." "But you had me," Jonathan replied, his voice rising in frustration. "I wanted to build a future with you. We were going to be partners in this. You didn't have to do this." Sophie looked away, tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't know how to stop. I was too far in, and now I've ruined everything." Jonathan felt his heart break as he looked at her. He had loved her. He still loved her in some ways, but the betrayal, the lies, they had cut too deep. He couldn't look at her the same way anymore. The restaurant around them felt colder now, the soft hum of conversations fading into the background as Jonathan processed everything Sophie had revealed. There was no going back. The future they had once dreamed of was no longer possible. He had been deceived, and trust once broken was not easily mended. "I need some time," Jonathan said, standing up from the table. "I need to think about everything." Sophie stood up too, her hands reaching out as if trying to hold on to him, but Jonathan stepped back. "Don't," he said quietly. "I need to be alone." He walked out of the restaurant, leaving Sophie behind. She stood there, the weight of her own choices crashing down on her as the door closed behind him. Jonathan stepped into the cold night air, his mind racing. He had to make a choice. What he had with Sophie could never be the same. But there was still Vanessa, still the love he had once lost and never truly forgotten. But was it enough to move forward with her? Was it enough to rebuild what was broken? As he walked through the empty streets of New York, Jonathan knew that whatever decision he made, his life would never be the same. He had faced the truth, and now he had to find his own way forward, one step at a time. Jonathan stood on the cold streets of New York, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the early evening. The city felt different now, as if the entire world had shifted beneath him in the span of a few hours. He had faced Sophie's confession, her betrayal, and now he was left to pick up the pieces of his broken heart. The next few days passed in a blur. Sophie, after their confrontation at the restaurant, did exactly what Jonathan had feared. She fled the city, disappearing with Ricky. Her absence in his life was like a heavy fog lifting, but it left a void that Jonathan wasn't sure how to fill. Her departure wasn't dramatic, but it carried an air of finality. Sophie had made her choice, and Jonathan knew there was nothing more to salvage. He couldn't pretend to be surprised. Her actions had been building for months, even years. But the pain of betrayal, of having trusted her with his heart and dreams, still stung. The woman he had once believed would be his partner for life was gone. And yet, as painful as it was, there was also a strange sense of relief. The fog of confusion and doubt that had clouded his thoughts for so long was starting to lift. Jonathan knew that this was a season of healing. He had spent so much of his time and energy focusing on relationships, on Sophie, on Vanessa, that he had neglected the most important relationship of all, his relationship with God. He had always been a man of faith, but the events of the past year had pulled him away from the foundation that had once been his guiding light. It was time to rededicate himself, to turn back to Christ and seek his guidance once more. Jonathan had always believed in Proverbs 3:5-6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. But the truth of those words had never felt so real as it did now. His understanding of life, love, and relationships had been clouded by his own desires and assumptions. Now he needed to trust God with the future, whatever it might hold. Jonathan took time away from his business and the hustle of the city to reflect and pray. He spent quiet mornings reading scripture, seeking God's wisdom, and asking for strength to move forward. He knew that healing wouldn't come overnight, but he also knew that God had a plan for his life, one that didn't depend on his own efforts or control. Each day, Jonathan felt more at peace. His prayers became more sincere, his faith more steadfast. As he rededicated himself to Christ, he began to sense God's presence more deeply, guiding him through the pain and offering comfort in the midst of his brokenness. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan began to connect with Vanessa again. Her return to the city had been unexpected, but it had stirred something in Jonathan, a longing for the companionship they had once shared. Yet this time, their relationship wasn't built on nostalgia or unspoken dreams. It was built on honesty, respect, and a shared commitment to follow God. Vanessa had also grown spiritually during their time apart. She had faced her own struggles and had come to understand the importance of trusting God in every area of her life. When Jonathan reached out to her, it was with a heart full of vulnerability, wanting to build something new and genuine, if God allowed it. They started with friendship, talking about life, faith, and the things that truly mattered. Jonathan was no longer the same man he had been when he first met Sophie. He was different now, stronger in his faith and more self-aware. He no longer felt the need to rush into another relationship or make any decisions without consulting God. One evening, as they sat on a park bench overlooking the skyline, Vanessa turned to him with a soft smile. "I'm glad we're reconnecting, Jonathan," she said, her voice sincere. "I never wanted to complicate things, but I've always cared about you." Jonathan nodded, his heart full. "I care about you too, Vanessa, but more than anything, I want to make sure I'm in the right place with God before I make any decisions. I've learned that I can't rush things or try to force what's not meant to be. I need to trust that God has a plan for me, for both of us." Vanessa smiled, her eyes full of understanding. "I respect that, Jonathan. I've been learning the same thing. We can't rush God's timing, but we can trust that He knows what's best for us." Jonathan felt a sense of peace settle over him. They had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about the future. He knew that whatever happened, God was guiding his steps. Meanwhile, Evelyn, Jonathan's mother, had watched from the sidelines as her son navigated the turbulence of his engagement with Sophie. As much as she had wanted to intervene, she knew that Jonathan had to come to his own conclusions. Still, she had never stopped praying for him, and God had answered her prayers in a way she hadn't expected. Evelyn had always been a source of wisdom and strength for Jonathan, and in these difficult times, her support had been invaluable. She had gently encouraged him to turn back to his faith, reminding him of the importance of trusting in God's plan, even when things didn't make sense. One afternoon, Jonathan sat down with his mother, the two of them sharing a quiet cup of tea. Evelyn looked at him with love and concern in her eyes, but there was also a peace about her that Jonathan envied. "You've been through a lot, my son," she said softly, "but I'm so proud of the man you're becoming. I've always prayed that God would give you wisdom, and I see that He is answering those prayers." Jonathan smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. "I don't know if I would have made it through this without you, Mom. Your prayers, your support, it's been more than I could have asked for." Evelyn's eyes softened. "You know, I've always believed that love isn't just about how we feel. It's about commitment, trust, and grace. God has shown me that in my own life, and I see you learning that too. I'm proud of the choices you're making, Jonathan. I know that no matter where life takes you, God's love will always be with you." Jonathan felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at his mother. Her words meant more to him than anything. He had always known that his mother loved him, but it was in moments like this, when she spoke from a place of deep faith and wisdom, that he truly understood the depth of that love. As the days passed, Jonathan found himself reflecting on the lessons God had taught him through his heartbreak. He had experienced the sting of betrayal, but he had also seen the beauty of grace, the grace that God had shown him, and the grace he needed to extend to others. He had learned that forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of anger. It was about releasing the power of hurt over his heart. It was about choosing to heal, even when the pain seemed unbearable. And in that process of forgiveness, Jonathan found freedom. Freedom to move forward, to love again, and to trust that God's plans for him were far greater than anything he could imagine. 1 Corinthians 13:4-7 echoed in his mind as he thought about the lessons he had learned about love. Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. It does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. These were the words that would guide him in his future relationships, in his pursuit of love, whether with Vanessa or in whatever God had planned for him. As Jonathan stood on the rooftop of his apartment building, looking out over the vast city below, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was at peace with where he was. He had been through the fire, and God had brought him through stronger, wiser, and more faithful than ever before. His heart was open to what God had next for him, whether that meant reconciliation with Sophie, a future with Vanessa, or simply walking alone for a season, trusting God's perfect timing. But one thing was certain: love, true love, was built on grace. It was patient, it was kind, and it was always rooted in God's everlasting love. Jonathan knew that this was the foundation he would build his life on from this day forward.